David had always found solace in the quiet hum of suburban life. Now in his mid-50s, he lived alone in a modest home nestled in a peaceful neighborhood. The manicured lawns, the occasional sound of children playing down the street, and the smell of freshly baked bread from a nearby bakery were the rhythm of his days. He was a retired Army veteran, having left the service decades ago, and though the memories of his time in the military lingered, they had slowly faded into the background, replaced by the simplicity of a routine life. It was a typical Saturday afternoon when David decided to clean out his garage, which had become cluttered with years of forgotten belongings. As he sorted through old tools, boxes of Christmas decorations, and dusty knickknacks, his hand brushed against something odd. A box tucked away in the corner, covered with a thick layer of dust. It looked so out of place amidst the ordinary clutter. He hadn't seen it in years, and for a moment he just stared at it, feeling a strange mix of hesitation and curiosity. His fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the box, and with it, a flood of memories from a past he had long tried to leave behind began to resurface. David carefully pried open the box, the hinges creaking as if reluctant to reveal its secrets. The stale scent of old papers, forgotten memories, and the faint odor of military gear hit him like a wave. For a moment he just sat there, the dust swirling around him, feeling as if he had just opened a portal to another life. Inside he found a collection of items that seemed like nothing more than relics of a distant past, letters tied together with frayed string, yellowed photographs, and a leather-bound journal with a worn cover. At first glance, they seemed like typical mementos, a snapshot of a man's life in the military. He picked up the letters, brushing off the dust, his fingers gliding over the ink-stained paper. They were from fellow soldiers, some with names he could barely remember. The photographs depicted men who were once close friends, smiling in front of tanks, in the field, or during downtime at base. A life he had lived and left behind. But then something caught his eye, a small tarnished medal at the bottom of the box. It was unlike any award he had ever seen, and certainly one he didn't remember earning. He turned it over in his hand, examining the worn edges and faded engraving. It had his name on it. A chill crept down his spine. Next his gaze fell on a photograph, a young David in uniform, standing tall and proud, but the date written on the back was years earlier than he remembered. The face beside him was unfamiliar, a soldier with dark eyes and an intense look that seemed oddly familiar. He stared at it, trying to place the face, but it didn't match anyone from his past, at least not any soldier he knew personally. The discovery sent a jolt through David. He didn't remember the medal, nor did he recall this man who had stood beside him. What was the connection between the two, and why had he never seen this photograph before? The questions burned in his mind, pushing him to seek answers. As David sat in the dim light of the garage, the dusty box beside him, his mind began to drift back to a time long ago, the days he had spent in the army. The years seemed to blend together in a haze of green uniforms, the scent of gunpowder and the sound of marching feet. But there was one thing that stood out more than anything else, the bond he shared with his fellow soldiers. The army had been more than just a job for David, it had been a family. They had each other's backs in ways that went beyond words. When you were in the field, you didn't just fight for yourself, you fought for the man standing next to you. Each face, each voice, was a part of the brotherhood. They'd seen each other at their lowest, faced danger together, and celebrated the smallest victories like they were the biggest triumphs. One of the faces David remembered most vividly was Jacob. Jacob had been everything a soldier could hope for, brave, reliable, and always ready with a joke to lift the mood during the long, grueling days. He was one of the first people David had met when he joined the unit, and from the start they'd clicked. They had trained together, shared stories, and looked out for one another in ways that only soldiers can. David could still hear Jacob's laugh, and see his easy smile, despite the hardships they faced in combat. But that was before everything changed. David's thoughts turned to their final deployment together, a mission that would forever be etched in his memory. It had been a chaotic time, and the mission was one of the most dangerous they'd ever undertaken. The skies had been dark with smoke, the ground riddled with landmines. The team had been stretched thin, and nerves were frayed. The last time David saw Jacob was in the midst of that madness. They had been ordered to split up to cover different positions. David with his squad had moved to secure the perimeter, while Jacob and another group were tasked with searching a nearby building. The air had been thick with tension, and even as they moved, there was a sense that something was off, but the orders had been clear. Then all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from all sides, chaos taking over every inch of the battlefield. David's heart pounded in his chest as he and his team rushed for cover. Minutes seemed like hours. When the dust settled and the fighting ceased, the team regrouped, but Jacob's group had never returned. The radio had crackled with static, and then a voice had come through. "Jacob and the others are missing. We're not sure what happened." The report came as a punch to David's gut. There had been no sign of Jacob or his team, and in the confusion of the battle, their whereabouts remained unclear. It was as though they had vanished into thin air. The days that followed were filled with frantic searches, endless reports, and a growing sense of dread. But no one could explain what had happened. David hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The way the higher-ups had handled the situation, the lack of answers, it all felt off. There were whispers among the men, but no one dared speak too loudly. The army had given their official report, declaring Jacob and his squad missing in action, but something about it never sat right with David. Now, as he looked at the photograph of Jacob, the guilt began to rise in his chest. He had been part of that mission, and he had never truly understood what happened to Jacob. There had always been a gnawing feeling that he could have done more, asked more questions, or pushed harder for answers. But at the time, he had accepted the official line, not knowing how much of it was true. David's fingers gripped the photograph tightly. The face of the young man in the photo, the one standing next to him in uniform, was unmistakably Jacob. It had to be. But why had he never seen this photo before? Why hadn't anyone mentioned it? The guilt pressed down harder, as he realized that, all these years later, the truth about Jacob's disappearance remained a mystery. And now, this forgotten box seemed to hold the key to the answers he had been searching for all these years. David turned the pages of the worn journal with trembling hands. It was as if the past had come alive again, each word and every entry pulling him deeper into a story he had long buried. The writing was hurried, the ink smudged in places, as though the author had been too quick to record the events unfolding around them. The entries from the mission where Jacob had gone missing were unsettling. David's eyes scanned the pages, trying to make sense of the words that seemed to hint at something darker. The first few entries described the chaos of the mission, the disorganization within the unit, and the overwhelming sense of confusion as they tried to move through hostile territory. But as he read on, the tone began to shift, and David could feel his chest tighten. One entry in particular caught his eye. It was dated the night after the attack, when they were waiting for reinforcements. The words were almost cryptic. "We didn't leave anyone behind, or did we?" David's heart raced. He could almost hear the writer's voice in his mind, raw, confused, filled with fear. The entry was written in a way that suggested doubt, a questioning of the orders given, the decisions made. It was clear that something wasn't right. The men had been told that Jacob and his squad had gone missing in action, but this journal entry raised a chilling question. Had they truly been left behind? Had something else happened that no one was willing to admit? David's mind spun with the possibilities. Could it be that the military had covered up the truth, that the higher-ups had made a decision to abandon Jacob and his squad? The more he read, the more the sense of disarray within their unit became clear. The men had been scattered, separated in ways that should never have happened. They were supposed to be a team, but the chaos of the mission, combined with poor leadership and lack of proper communication, had left them vulnerable. But what unsettled David the most was the growing sense that there was more to Jacob's disappearance than anyone had ever let on. The entries were filled with mentions of unexplained occurrences, communication failures, the sudden loss of contact with certain teams, and the odd behavior of a few higher-ranking officers. There were whispers of things being covered up, of information being deliberately withheld. But no one dared to speak openly. David felt a knot in his stomach as he read further. Had the military lied to him all these years? Had they intentionally left Jacob behind? And why hadn't anyone ever questioned it more deeply? He had always accepted the official report, the one that declared Jacob missing in action, but now, everything seemed so much more complicated. The story he had been told didn't fit with what was in this journal. The truth had been twisted, concealed by those in power. The more he thought about it, the more angry and confused he became. How could this have happened? And why had no one ever fought for Jacob's memory? The guilt from all those years of silence settled heavily on David's shoulders. He had trusted the system, trusted his superiors, but now he wondered if that trust had been misplaced. What if Jacob had been left behind intentionally? What if David had been part of a cover-up, even if he hadn't known it at the time? The weight of the questions grew heavier as David realized that the answers were just within reach, and they might destroy everything he thought he knew about his time in the army. The guilt gnawed at David relentlessly. As he sat in the silence of his garage, surrounded by the remnants of his past, a need to uncover the truth overwhelmed him. He couldn't just ignore what he had discovered in the journal. It was as if Jacob's ghost was calling out to him, demanding that he find out what really happened. Determined to uncover the whole story, David reached out to the few comrades he had kept in touch with over the years. The calls were awkward at first. Years of silence had made them strangers in many ways, but soon the conversation turned to their shared experiences, to the time they had spent together in the field. One by one, he contacted the men who had served alongside him during that fateful mission. The stories that emerged were more unsettling than anything David could have imagined. Old memories resurfaced, many of which had been buried deep in the past, and the more he listened, the clearer the picture became. One particular phone call stood out, a conversation with a former soldier named Rick, who had been part of Jacob's unit. Rick's voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "Jacob, he wasn't supposed to be where he was," he said, his tone heavy with regret. "He got caught in a dangerous position, one the higher-ups had ordered us to avoid. But they pushed us forward anyway. I never understood why. There were whispers about it, about a decision that put everyone at risk, but no one dared ask questions." David's heart sank. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but they painted a picture he hadn't wanted to see. Rick's words revealed something even more disturbing. Jacob's disappearance wasn't just a random tragedy. It was tied to a higher-level cover-up, one that involved a decision made by commanding officers that had endangered the lives of many soldiers. Rick hesitated before continuing. "They didn't just forget about Jacob. I think he was deliberately left behind. No one wanted to take responsibility for it." The words hung in the air like a weight David couldn't shake. Deliberately left behind. The thought crashed over him like a tidal wave. How had he not seen it? Why had they been so willing to let their own comrades fall into the abyss? David felt his stomach churn with a mixture of anger and disbelief. The truth was worse than he had ever imagined. Jacob had been sacrificed, and no one had ever told him. As the phone call ended, David sat back, stunned. He now knew there was no turning back. The secrets buried in the past had to be unearthed, no matter the cost. David sat at his kitchen table, staring at the pile of papers in front of him, photographs, the journal, and the testimonies of his old comrades. It was all there, the truth about Jacob's disappearance and the cover-up that had been hidden for so many years. The weight of what he had learned felt unbearable, but it also ignited something inside him. Jacob's name couldn't be lost to history. His story had to be told. With trembling hands, David reached for his phone and dialed a number he had never imagined calling. He'd seen her on the news before, a reporter known for uncovering military scandals. Her reputation for digging deep and exposing uncomfortable truths had made her the perfect person to help bring Jacob's story to light. He hesitated only for a moment before leaving a message, detailing what he had uncovered. It was time to stop running from the truth. The reporter, Rachel, called back within hours. She listened intently, her voice calm but full of determination. She understood the gravity of what David was saying, and together they began to make plans. They would meet, go over the evidence and begin the long process of exposing what had happened. But even as David moved forward, a part of him hesitated. He had spent his entire life in the army, and the military had always been a source of pride for him. What would this do to his reputation? What would it mean for the men and women still serving? There was so much at stake. But the guilt was stronger than his fears. Jacob deserved justice, and David couldn't remain silent any longer. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. The story broke like a storm, making headlines across the nation. The revelation of a military cover-up, a decision that had led to the abandonment of soldiers during a mission, sent shockwaves through the military community and the general public. David's name became synonymous with bravery, his actions sparking conversations that had been long overdue. The truth, buried for years, was finally coming to light. Veterans and their families flooded David with messages, reaching out to thank him for speaking up. Some were moved by the courage it took to expose such a painful truth, while others had their own stories to share. Many were survivors of similar incidents, men and women whose friends had disappeared under suspicious circumstances, their names lost in the bureaucratic shuffle. David's decision to speak out gave them hope that finally someone was listening. One by one, they reached out to him, sharing stories of their own experiences, their voices breaking through the silence of years gone by. As the story gained traction, it triggered investigations into other cases of missing soldiers from past wars. These investigations began to unravel more hidden truths, stories of soldiers left behind, orders given to cover up inconvenient losses, and lives sacrificed in the name of secrecy. The more they uncovered, the darker the picture became. David felt a complicated mix of emotions as the media buzzed around him. He was proud that Jacob's story was finally being heard, that the injustices of the past were being exposed. But there was also deep sorrow. Jacob's name had been cleared, but justice had come too late to change the past. There was no bringing back the men and women who had been lost, no undoing the decisions that had led to their fate. Still, David knew that by speaking out, he had made a difference. The truth might prevent future tragedies, and for that he could find some peace. David sat in his living room, the old box now open and spread out before him. The weight of everything that had transpired settled around him like a quiet storm. He had never imagined that the dusty, forgotten box would lead him on such an unexpected journey. His life had changed in ways he never thought possible. The answers he had sought for so long had finally been uncovered, but they had come at a cost, emotionally, personally, and professionally. As he looked at the items in the box, letters, photographs, the journal, David reflected on how the truth about Jacob and the army had brought him a sense of closure. He had spent decades carrying the guilt of Jacob's disappearance, and now, at last, he understood what had really happened. Jacob's name was no longer just another statistic, it had been restored. The mystery had been solved, the cover-up exposed. The weight of the past had lifted, but with it, something new had emerged. David had never expected that speaking out would give him a sense of purpose again. For so many years, he had been adrift, caught between the pride of his service and the shadows of unanswered questions. But now, his actions had given him a reason to stand tall once more. Justice had been served, though it came too late for Jacob and the others. The journey had been difficult, painful at times, but David found peace in knowing that at last the truth had been told, and that was enough. As David sat in his living room, surrounded by the remnants of his past, he realized that uncovering the truth about Jacob and the hidden injustices of the military had given him a sense of purpose he never thought he'd find again. Though the journey was painful, it led to a much-needed revelation that brought justice, even if it came too late. David's bravery to speak out not only gave Jacob his name back, but it also opened the door to uncovering other forgotten stories, ensuring that these soldiers would not be forgotten. If you found David's journey inspiring, please like, share, and subscribe to hear more powerful stories like this one. Let's continue to honor those who fought for truth and justice, no matter the cost.